Excellent. Okay, welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the Executive Vice President and a Senior Fellow here. I'm pleased to welcome you today in person and online to our event, More Than the Money, Beyond the Dollars, How do we ensure that the World Bank's evolution means an evidence and impact revolution too? So during this week's spring meetings discussions on the World Bank's evolution to retain the twin goals while responding to global challenges like climate change and pandemic risks, there is a lot of focus on amounts and sources of money. But less attention, I think, is paid to an inconvenient truth, which is that few policymakers know what works to make measurable progress against development and global challenges. Few programs are rigorously evaluated, and particularly in the climate space, where the idea is to add much more money, results are often so poorly defined and measured that policy and programs fail to achieve their lofty goals. And so scarce and therefore precious resources are often deployed with very little attention to their efficiency and their impact. And too often we just can't answer the question of whether what we do is genuinely making a difference. And for climate mitigation specifically, the limited data so far suggests that the most cost-effective interventions could be 260 times as effective as the least effective ones. So we really do need to look critically at the portfolio of things that we're investing in. Now, the World Bank's Evolution Roadmap recognizes the need to increase investments in evidence and impact evaluation to guide domestic spending, to inform operations that would support global public goods or global challenges, and, quote, to enhance the quality of project design and implementation, informing mid-course corrections and filling knowledge gaps that then benefit both that project and subsequent projects. And the recent Development Committee paper underscores the agenda, and I'm going to quote Ajay Banga, who was here last week. He said, the World Bank should continue to grow as a knowledge bank, and that we won't win the fight ahead without taking some risks. And the trick is, don't make the same mistake twice. And if you make the same mistake twice, you should go work somewhere else. I'll leave you to think about what that means. So with global challenges very high on the international agenda and financing perhaps set to increase in the coming years, policymakers need to use evidence and evaluation to ensure that resources are spent as effectively as possible for development and global goals. And that is really the meaning of development effectiveness. So given this imperative, why have decision makers within governments, aid agencies, and multilaterals, and the multilateral development banks, despite lots of progress, and I should acknowledge that a lot of the big and important evaluations and knowledge comes from the MDBs, or with MDB support, but they still haven't fully harnessed the value of evidence to improve outcomes. So looking forward, how can we as a community renew momentum for the systematic generation and use of evidence at the MDBs and beyond? We ran a working group here with 40 policymakers, researchers, and practitioners here at the Center for Global Development, co-chaired with Ruth Levine. And today's event will help us discuss how the working group's recommendations can be taken forward in practice at the multilateral development banks like the World Bank. And we've brought together colleagues with expertise from the whole system. We have our colleague from the World Bank. We have someone who's been working at the Inter-American Development Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to go beyond the money only. What can we get done? So we're going to turn first to our keynote speaker, who is Bård Vegar Solhjell. He is the Director General of NORAD. And before NORAD, he served as Secretary General of the Worldwide Fund for Nature in Norway. But most importantly, actually, Bård was a politician. So he knows how to speak to people about why this is important. So I'm really excited to have you here, and I turn over the stage to you. Thanks.
So thank you, Amanda. And let's find out afterwards if I know how to speak to people about these things. But thanks a lot for having me. Great pleasure to be here with our very good partner, the Center for Global Development, which we work together with and rely on for so many important things. But let me turn to our work in NORAD now on this, the Norwegian Development Agency. And let me there's the one, yeah. Let me start by showing you this screen. This is written in Norwegian. And I have a feeling many of you don't speak a lot of Norwegian, but it says "fakta har makta" in Norwegian, and it rhymes. And in English, it translates to, directly translation is "the facts should have the power." That's a bit long, so we use facts inform policy. But of course, it doesn't sound as good as it does in Norwegian when we say "fakta har makta." But this is our internal slogan for our work to systematically use knowledge in everything we do and to build our work around that. And there was a reason I wanted a slogan, which is also, a bit simplifying in a way, because it's not always about facts. It's about analysis, understanding, all that. It's because you have to get people to just know about what are you working with. And a simple slogan, which can also be debated a bit, it creates that knowledge or what is it we are working, or what's the goal here. What I'm going to do now is to first take you through a little bit about why are we doing this, and then a few points of what are we doing, what have we learned from this. So first, there are two main reasons why we're doing it. The first is, of course, and some of you will know this very well. What we know now, right, is that the differences in cost effectiveness in different aid intervention is enormous. Not big, it's enormous. And this is a graph showing 108 different interventions within global health, which is probably the field, where we have the most knowledge from impact evaluations, for instance. It's done by the WHO and others, and they went through it. And it shows us that a lot of interventions are, not very cost efficient, but some are extremely cost efficient. These are more cost efficient than anything you could probably think of on the Norwegian public budget and probably the American or Belgian public budget or whatever. There's hardly any better value for money. And just this is an important point. It doesn't mean that the others are not good aid measures, right? They can be efficient, they can work, they can give people better lives. But their cost efficiency is just very different from the West ones. So if we were to move just a little bit of our resources from those who are maybe quite good to the extremely good ones, it can make a huge difference. So that's number one. There's an extreme difference, and we have quite a lot of knowledge, not enough, but quite a lot of knowledge, at least in some areas. Then there's another reason, and this, comes a little bit from my background as a politician and as well, because I know that politicians tend to think that they know. We used to have a feeling that we would know, and it's politics to decide, but it's not always intuitive what actually works, rather the opposite. And let me take you through one example. Let's say we want to get more girls to go to school, right, in developing countries. So which intervention, if we have to choose between three, should we choose? A scholarship for gifted girls, free school uniforms, or school-based deworming? I can see that you probably know, but I've tried this on people who don't work in this field, and they frequently miss. So, okay, first let's look at these two, right? And they're measured in additional years of schooling. So we can learn from this that free primary school uniforms, and this is from Kenya, is more cost efficient, so we get more years of schooling compared to girls' merit scholarships. But introducing school-based deworming, the effect is enormous compared to the two other measures, more than 100 times as cost efficient. This is not an argument that all we should do in global development is deworming. Okay, don't miss it. It's an argument for the fact that we don't always know, and if we measure, we can understand better how we should get as much effect as possible. Anything. Also note that there are lots of things that are difficult to measure, but there are many things that are not so difficult to measure. And some would also argue that you can't measure, of course, you can't measure pears and apples, right? I would answer that, well, they're fruit. Let's start there. Okay, so that's a bit why. So then let me run through some of the points that I think there are for our work. What are we doing? And then first a little context, right? Norway is a very big donor per capita, a quite big donor in absolute numbers, but a very, very small administration to that. We are really lean administration for quite big resources. We have less people in NORAD than USAID have on the ground in Kenya, actually, right? So this means that we don't implement ourselves, right? We always work through partners. Everything we do is through partners. So to get this done, we have to get our partners to work in these ways. The other thing is, of course, that I haven't checked our knowledge department compared to other ones, but I guess the World Bank has a bigger knowledge department than NORAD have people. So we have to use other agencies and organizations and partners' knowledge to do this well. That's the first thing. It's the way we have to work. Second part, that means also that the main thing we are doing is to introduce a way of knowledge managing or knowledge management within our organization. So we are now organizing all the grants we manage on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Climate and Environment into portfolios. And these portfolios, they start with a theory of change, where we try to say, okay, there are lots of things we could achieve, but this is the main theory based on experience and analysis we're creating. Within that theory of change, we use a roadmap for partnerships and try to organize a set of partnerships around that. And we also have introduced something we call a knowledge plan, which is a plan for what we have to know in an issue, the things we have to learn and understand better. And of course, finally, how to measure and to manage and use results. And I emphasize use results because there are lots of results out there. The challenging part I find is you actually implementing it into our own use. Then we have started doing this, and we've established portfolios for approximately maybe half of the different thematic fields, but we have a way to go. And what's still very challenging for us here as part of this is, of course, how to use it for systematic prioritization across the board. It is very challenging for many reasons, parts of it because there are measurements problems, but also because we see that prioritizing is different. People in our organization, they have an engagement to the different agreements and fields they're working with. Our partners the same, and making systematic tools for prioritization is also difficult because politicians have valid political ideas and things they want to prioritize. But portfolio management is number 2. Number 3, which is important, I think, is that if you're going to do global development, well, you can't only rely on the established evidence or knowledge. You also have to innovate and try new things. Even the best interventions that has been proven on decade once were innovations, right? Somebody first tried something because they had an idea, and then they didn't fail more than once probably, but then found out that, okay, let's do it that way and so on. So I think understanding that it's not maths, right? It's just you can take a lot of results and put them into a machine and get something out. But the combination of using knowledge with a systematic approach to innovation, and innovation isn't just throwing lots of things up, and it's systematic work that too. That's the third thing, and the fourth and final point I would make and end there is about how we are working with our partners with this. Which is, so far it's been in a way easier and better than I feared. And I'll use civil society as an example because Norwegian development assistance relies heavily on civil society. Approximately 23% of everything we spend from Norway's side goes through civil society. So they're extremely important to us. And we've not had a systematic enough approach to their learning, and we've not always demanded a lot. So we are using a partly stick, partly carrot approach now. We will gradually want to put demands on their learning, on their production of results, and also to actually use those results. But we are also doing incubators with them. We are trying to do things to spread our knowledge, to be able to create arenas where they can learn across and so on at the same time. But getting our partners on board on this is essential. And our partners vary there. Of course, they're the World Bank. There are some institutions that are much better than us. And then there are also quite a few who haven't, really come to that point. What we don't know yet is how our political system and how our partners will react at a time when we are actually using this knowledge for prioritizations and choices. That remains to be seen, but it's of course a big challenge. So to sum up, we are a knowledge organization. We've used knowledge used knowledge for years. What we are trying to do now is to systematize it and to use more of the best and modern research methods. But we totally rely on others. And my main message, in a way, ending where you started, Amanda, is that we spend a lot of resources on discussing how much money we should put into global development. And of course, that is important. But if we just spent a fraction of that time and effort on how much we could get out of the resources we actually use, that would be probably at least as important. Thank you.
So, panel? Okay, well, thank you so much for your remarks. You can sit anywhere, I think.
I know there was an order.
My child is calling me at an inopportune time. Okay. So now we'll turn to our panelists to talk through how their organizations are thinking about evidence, overcoming challenges, shaping future plans. And with us, we have Ariana Legovini, who's the director of the Development Impact Evaluation Department, or DIME, at the World Bank. Koldo Echevarria, who's the former Director General at ESADE Business and Law School and a former manager at the Inter-American Development Bank, including as General Manager of Strategic Planning and Development Effectiveness. And most importantly, he's a new non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. We have Dean Carlin, who's the Chief Economist for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Very excited to have you. Marie-Ange Saraka-Yao, who's the Managing Director of Resource Mobilization, Private Sector Partnerships, and Innovative Finance at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and then we're rejoined by board as the Director General of NORAD. So I'll share an opening question with each of you. I'd ask you to keep it concise to help make sure we have time to ask more questions and for discussion. And as a reminder to the online audience, you can submit questions via YouTube, Twitter @CGDev, or emailing events@cgdev.org. And for those in person, we'll be passing around the microphone, so get your questions ready. So let's dive in. So reflecting on what you've heard, what do you think, what are practical ways that the bank could use to link the agenda on global challenges and knowledge generation as the reform efforts advance? And what would you see as roadblocks to moving quickly?
Oh, thank you, Amanda. First of all, it was music to my ears, everything I've heard from Bard during the presentation. Fundamentally, we are in the midst of change. And I was very, very encouraged by your interview, actually, with our prospective president, calling for innovation and research. I think we are ready to move from pilot stages to the next stage. We have seen a complete revolution from academia in transforming development economics into an empirical science. And from our side, we have invested in transforming development finance into something quite different. And so when we are talking about scale up, we're actually talking about changing the operational model of the bank. Introducing a different way of preparing projects, going from piecemeal project preparation, which is costly and inefficient, to more portfolio level preparation where we can inject a lot of the knowledge that has been generated in the last 20 years and transform the economic potential of all the operations that go in the field. But not only that, but introduce early trials during their implementation to change the path for delivering development impact. So what we have learned so far that can inform the new global agenda is that if we do invest into knowledge, as we have done, for example, in poverty reduction, we can actually come with very definitive answers on how to reduce poverty by 20 percentage points, even in contexts like Afghanistan that are very fragile. So we can come up with very rigorous answers. But of course, knowledge takes time to generate. And what we have really invested in is the technology through which that knowledge is generated. And that technology is an institutional technology. We all know there is a lot of institutional inertia. There is a lot of repetition and replication, and there is some efficiency in that as well, but also big stumbling blocks into taking something like what we are talking about to scale. What is that we're talking about? Basically, transforming mentalities. We are not supposed to know everything at time zero. We are supposed to develop projects that actually are a set of options and introduce a lot of innovation and testing to understand actually how to optimize, moving from the investment loans as we're doing them today to more adaptive programming and more cross-country interactions in those adaptive programming so that we can use the early countries developing some of the ideas as to develop the lessons and the learning to inform the rest. I think the evolution roadmap is exactly what we need to implement a new model that aligns the bank across the climate agenda, pandemics, even things like learning losses experienced during COVID. We know some things about how to solve them, but we actually have a lot more to learn. And certainly on pandemic preparedness, we are still, needing to invest. Yes, and conflict and fragility. There are many areas in which female labor force participation is another area which there's been a lot of work, but not definitive work on how to push countries like Jordan or India into owning their the full productive potential of their populations.
Okay, great. Thanks for those insights. I'm going to turn to Koldo. He led an effort together with colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank to try and this was some time ago, about a decade ago, to try and get project teams at the start of the project to focus on development effectiveness. And we heard the new president of the Inter-American Development Bank, Ilan Goldfein, speak of development effectiveness as one of his top priorities. So what has happened over the period in which the IDB tried to build some of this evidence generation into projects more systematically? What would you take home as messages?
Well, thank you, Amanda. Thank you for the invitation, and also thank you for organizing this. I think it's very timely that we discuss more about impact and results in the context of this evolution roadmap, and possibly as well the reform of other MDBs that will be coming soon later. Just to be brief, when we work on the new development effectiveness framework, and it was approved more than a decade ago, we had like two big objectives. One was to do the right things, and the other one was to do things right. I believe that we have progressed a lot in doing things right. That means that the quality of project has improved thanks to a set of incentives that were introduced in project design. And that means that, for example, a lot of IDB projects, much more than in other institutions, have rigorous evaluation methods applied to the projects. And that also means that projects are very transparent in showing how they are going to deliver results. And that's possibly a reason that you saw less effective projects at the IDB, because the system is very transparent in showing what is going on. What I don't think we were so successful in achieving was the other part, the doing the right things. And this comes to a discussion that we have already started here. Ariana was mentioning it, Bart also mentioned it, is how we move from evidence to decision making, how we move to use the evidence that we already have on what works into new interventions. And that goes into, I would say, a much tougher change within MDBs. You go to the case of the Inter-American Development Bank, it is a very demand-driven institution, which has a very good dimension, which is that countries have more ownership of the projects, but at the same time makes the programming a little bit opportunistic, I would say. I mean, programming is very decentralized, is very much piecemeal in the sense that there's not really a portfolio approach, and this is something Ariana was mentioning. We need to move more to a programming that goes to a bigger view of what we are trying to do. And at the same time, I mean, the borrowing countries in programming are basically worried by financial flows. So they are not very much worried by development effectiveness concerns at that point. So what can be done? There are a lot of things that you can do to improve programming. It has to do with the incentives within the organization. Of course, you can introduce much more evidence-based dialogue with the country. And my experience, at least, is that countries react positively when you bring evidence to the discussion. They may want to intervene in education, but they will be very open to listen on what works and what doesn't work. The other thing is possibly to look at programming from a more portfolio approach, maybe having a combination in the portfolio of projects which are more experimental, more innovative, that have more leeway in terms of the structure of managing the project, and projects that are based on evidence and can have a sort of fast track to be approved and implemented. And third, I also believe that, and Ariana was mentioning this, I think we have evidence to make a leap forward in relation to some of the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. But I'm not sure that the piecemeal project approach is going to deliver on that. We need to go back to a different way of programming. We need to look to evidence-based or results-based interventions. We need to look to possibly sort of budget support interventions that ensure funding for a period of time to governments if they do certain things in a sector. I mean, combining these things, we could possibly change incentives and make not only things right, but also the right things.
Do the right things. I mean, so a lot of the discussion, by the way, on the roadmap, and we can come back, is, you know, if we really are going to scale up financing so much, should we go beyond specific kinds of projects? But on the other hand, a lot of the evidence that we have is, you know, fairly specific, actually, on what works, and there's an opportunity cost to that money. Which I'll turn to you, Dean, next to reflect on this point. But you started off, and one of your priorities has been to ensure high quality evidence is available and used to better inform USAID's programming and policies. Can you reflect a little bit on that? And what other opportunities do you see to work with the banks as they build this agenda further?
Right.
You've been on both sides of the coin too. You've been doing these kinds of studies, and yeah.
So, so a few thoughts. First of all, for those who don't know, I still feel very new to USAID. So, although I'm now in month 5, so I have to stop saying that at some point. But a few reflections on this. The first, and this applies at different levels, but it applies to all of us. We're all tiny here, even the biggest of us, the bank. USAID, fine, largest bilateral by the statistics I've seen, not as a percentage of GDP though, obviously, but which is, let's be transparent about our statistics here. But we're tiny. It's the local governments that spend the money, and so that's why, in my view, we can try to be as effective as we can with the resources because, of course, like you're going to spend the money, let's do it well. But our biggest value added in this entire process is going to come through knowledge generation and partnerships. Like, because it doesn't really matter if we generate the knowledge if you don't actually have a process for getting that to be kind of communal knowledge from our partners in the country. So that's the broadest thought. And I just see it as a cascading. Like, I'm small at USAID and then the bank and on up from there. So it's all Ariana. It's all on Ariana, basically, is the point.
Get it done.
Is the punchline, Okay, so then basically I've kind of three broad thoughts for the cascading of what I see as in terms of how I think about this. The first is actually putting on my other hat as a researcher. There's a lot that there's some basic herding cats, public goods problems in the actual production, and I'm being very dorky now, and I'm talking about things like what we measure in methods issues, where more can be done to improve the kind of consistency and quality of different measurements. Some things we have better information about than others, things that are on the more qualitative side. For instance, we need a lot more work done on how to measure some of these issues. And that actually really matters a lot, because the point of being able to get to charts like what you put up has to be from seeing the aggregation of evidence. Not like, no one study should ever be considered the end all, where we write this one study from this one country and all of a sudden you say, great, let's go do this, right? And so, but if the studies aren't better able to have some common language in terms of the dorky stuff, that's a problem. And we don't invest enough in that. And that's one. The second level is on the cost effectiveness analysis. It is taking the aggregation of the evidence that's out there. It's being able to do charts like what you put up. Those come from individual studies, but each of those has been kind of validated through a few different studies and things like this. Although the uniform one, I can show you one that's negative. So that could, there in terms of like cost-effective analysis and building that in, and that's very much our focus at USAID in the way we're kind of organizing the office. I think there's two kind of sub-points that I would just highlight. One is that less is more, and I mean that partly from just a communications and a programming style of recognizing that for a given sector, it really helps to have a base case that says, look, worst case scenario, if you want to promote X, here's a base case, and we know it generates this, and it's very simple. You want to do something else? Great, beat that, because every dollar you spend on something else is the dollar not spent on that. And that's actually a much better way of kind of bringing people into that way of thinking than just saying, oh, that's not effective, right, and this is effective. It's like really making salient, like, take education. You want to run a program with like 17 things in there that have unknown impact. Don't compare it to nothing. Say, wait a second, that money could be doing teaching at the right level. So for every dollar you spend on something else, that's this many kids not getting this other program. How do you want to make that trade-off? And so that's part of what I mean by the less is more, in that I think that way of thinking is going to end up pushing us towards more streamlined and I suspect with that more efficient programs. And the second part, and I think both of you have hit on this point, is that there's variation in ideas, but there's also variation in implementation. So take that chart you put up there, for example. Like, I have no doubt that the ones that are the high ones, right? Some of those there might be variation in impact, like the Ecuador negative point estimate, but I also mean it on implementation decisions where some of those might be things where there's some fixed cost to running it, and if you do it at $5 million, it's not cost effective, but if you run it at 50 million, it is. And just doing better costing analysis to understand what the fixed costs are, how to drive up participation rates, how to get that's just wonky stuff on the implementation side that could radically, change the rank order of some of those interventions. And we don't, we need to do more on that. So that's the second. Then the last is that only is also good when, we do better meta-analysis, better pooling of results so that we understand what is the collective evidence on, say, cash transfers, not just one study, but a collection. But ultimately, goes back to where I started. We want to get, the ideal is to work collaboratively with governments and with local researchers, collaborating on these, meta-analysis, individual evidence generation, aggregating it up to others, because that's what's going to move the needle. It's the off-ramp from any one of USAID's awards to then see the government policy get shifted, and that's where the wins are going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely critical and important to the things I'm trying to do at USAID. It's not the USAID way of doing things. That's the reality. So it's not going to be an overnight shift by any means. That's more World Bank style.
I mean, I think it's good, some donors work less with governments than others. And of course, maybe USAID will kind of grow that piece of the portfolio or go in with other partners in these programs with governments, with each bringing a comparative advantage. I also think the other point that you raised that came out really clearly in our working group was cost data. It is a little wonky, but on the other hand, it completely changes what we're talking about, the cost structures in any given location, and the feasibility of implementing different ideas at scale. Which turns us, let me turn now to Marie-Ange. Gavi is looking ahead to its next strategic phase, and I think, all of us now own the difference between a cost-efficacious vaccine and a cost-effective vaccination program in reality. And I think that's sort of the next frontier in global health too, right? How can we support governments and civil society organizations as relevant to really implement at scale cost effectively? So can you tell us a little bit about the role of evidence and evaluation in Gavi's approach and the kinds of issues you're thinking about?
Yes, no, thank you so much, Amanda. Indeed, I think Gavi from the start, as you know, has followed a very rigorous evidence-based decision and policy-making model. I mean, it's important when, we help vaccinate more than half of the world's children. So I think 58% of all births in the world are in Gavi-eligible countries, and we have already helped immunize 1 billion children. So we do actually, the scale, the cost effectiveness of how it happens is very important. And for this, of course, we have a learning and evaluation team that really looks at the monitoring, the cost effectiveness, the accountability framework, commissioning the studies really in countries, and a lot of them, and also a lot of independent studies. And again, we are an alliance, so to the point that has been made of working in partnerships, it's very important, and alliance with many of the people in this room, but also with CSOs and other groups that do the study. So it's quite critical. I think maybe one of the things I want to emphasize that is important, that we are doing more and more, is, my colleagues here talked a lot about the ex ante and ex post evaluation and how you take it back in programming. But when you are faced with issues where today actually we have seen it with the pandemic, we see it with climate change, where there's an issue of speed, of scale, coming up very quickly, being able to monitor and to learn as you go and as you sail the ship is very important. And this we have done much more. And for this, and what Bart said earlier in his introduction is very important, is the innovation and partnering also with other type of groups. And for this, we have worked with tech pioneers. When you think about immunization and cost effectiveness, one of the key things, of course, is the key thing for vaccine, what it is the cold chain, right? And that the vaccine don't get wasted on the tarmac because they cannot reach on time and at the right temperature. And so we partnered with various tech pioneers to actually put sensors in fridges and then get to cloud-based system the live data. And guess what? What did we learn? You know, going back to the point of Bart, I would have thought, you know, thinking I know everything. Oh, it's probably because of the heat, you know, because we work in so many countries that don't have electricity. And guess what? It was too cold. It was not the heat. The vaccines were getting wasted because it was too cold. And in 19, yeah, no, not just for ultra cold chain, even for the normal ones. So in 99% of the cases, so getting this information in real-time data to the ministers of health in each country, and we started with 14, now it's being rolled out, is priceless. And guess what? It's also priceless for the manufacturers of fridges, because then they had to review and to revisit and to test it. So I think more of that learning. Yeah. That is fundamental, because imagine if I had wasted, you know, 5 years at the end of the Gavi strategic period to figure out that all the, you know, so that's quite important. Yeah. So I think these are the type of information and using some of the technology and digital and so on that exists that we bring to our client countries is quite fundamental. Yeah. And key. And these are also, of course, the type of thing, you know, we partner with the bank and that we are very keen to do more, partnering in programs, helping countries prioritize the vaccines, but also where to do it, how to coordinate, of course, on some of these logistic issues, because vaccines are not just about the products, right? We learned that. It's about how you roll them out is quite key. So I think that's really how this just-in-time that help increase, of course, the effectiveness of the vaccine. And I'm pretty sure that on the graph of Bart, actually, the most cost-effective one was probably vaccine.
Probably.
Depends on which vaccine. You still have choices inside vaccines.
Exactly.
But I mean, I think this idea of like doing the right thing, which vaccines? Yeah. What if we have a cancer vaccine? Are we going to subsidize that through Gavi in low-income countries versus maybe doing implementation research on water? So there are these big resource allocation decisions, and we haven't quite gotten to that point. You have a specific kind of mechanism to look comparatively at the cost effectiveness of vaccines ex ante. Yes. And I love the idea of looking at it in implementation as well. Bart, coming back to you, you, NORAD and USAID have been focusing on locally led development and localization in aid as a priority going forward. But sometimes we don't see that emphasis extended to this kind of evidence and evaluation work. Often it's, you know, it can be quite separate from the usual milieu of implementation that's happening at the country level. So can you tell us a little bit about how NORAD is thinking about marrying these two ideas, more evidence and evaluation that we want to see affect policy? And then I'll come to you, Dean, to say something about that as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because it's really difficult. And I've thought about that many times, really, that these, you know, these agendas come from very different places, in a way. You know, the impact evaluation, aid effectiveness agenda very much comes from, you know, big Western institutions using methods from our best university and so on to, often in economics, to measure, while the localization agenda, very more locally led development as we call it, very much comes from understanding that each context is unique, that you can't always compare, that you have to rely on the local knowledge, the understanding in each specific case. So I think marrying it is difficult, but I think understanding, it's about at least understanding the limits of knowledge management. So in my intervention, I decided to emphasize all that we can do and the knowledge we actually do have, because when I started working in global development, I was a bit surprised that actually we knew much more in a way than in many other policy fields. But it doesn't mean that you can just, several touched on, then you can just evaluate lots of things across and then say, here's the solution, we implement that. it's an understanding. You can use it as an understanding of what kinds of instruments or interventions would work. Then I think the contextual knowledge in each case and the ownership is extremely important for that. And one a place where you might marry that is that what we find, of course, cost efficiency is also a lot about, like Dean said, how do you implement? Mm-hmm. How do you tweak all that things with your partner? How is it done on the ground in a way that that really creates that effect of the intervention? Then also, just to end, there's another issue. Of course, there are also lots of things that you can't realistically measure well in a quantitative way. Say, what kinds of human rights defenders would you support in a context? I don't think, maybe I'm a bit negative, but I don't think you will ever get to a point where you can measure that quantitatively. It's the knowledge and deep understanding on the ground, right, that will matter. So, really good question. I think we have to work in both ways. That's my best answer.
Yeah, and maybe I would invite you, Ariana, to reflect on ways that you've been working collaboratively with governments. Of course, it's not just DIME, it's really very distributed through the bank. What kinds of lessons have you taken home from that process of embedding evaluation functions in government, for example?
Yeah, I would say that we should not forget the importance of managerial capacity. So we find, we invest a lot in the managerial capacity of implementing agencies to actually achieve high levels of compliance even with an initial design. It makes a huge difference. So in the case that I mentioned in Afghanistan, we achieved 100% compliance by building the monitoring systems that allowed the implementers to actually know whether every woman was getting the full package that was planned for. That managerial capacity actually has huge potential. We support them not just by training, and in fact, in these implementing agencies, we'll have like 5, 6, 8 trainings per year of local staff, but also building the data systems, integrating data, teaching them how to use data to improve processes and functionality of government. That we discuss very little. But in fact, the margins of improvement, we have improved the margins of improvement in mediation in the justice sector in Kenya by 60%. Improved the efficiency of justice in Senegal by 20%. When in procurement, 10% improvements in cost of public procurement. By Uberizing, improving autonomy, by doing many things that seem small, but can have very large impacts on the quality of government. And by doing that, we also lower the cost, make space, fiscal space for doing other things. Now, that investment in local capacities is not built in a day. Mm-hmm. It is the result not of one study, but kind of working with the same implementing agencies for years. We have collaborations that span 12 years, 10 years, that continue building those capacity, building the dashboards, building the digital tools and understanding of how to use data interactively to then improve things around. Also, I want to say about ideas and in the co-production. Ideas and innovations don't come from the researchers. They come also from the researchers, but they come a bit from everywhere and kind of understanding the context and what people have struggled with. And so the initial stages of actually figuring out what the good questions to ask are. I always ask my own team to think about where are the big margins. Let's focus our research on things that can really be transformational. But sometimes small things like the pricing of an incentive, as we have found in one example in Ghana, can double the number of trees being planted. By just getting that one parameter right can be quite transformational. But sometimes it's the innovation. Mm-hmm. And I want to mention something that we did with NURAD on the ed tech in northern Nigeria, with technology from your neighbors from Finland, from the private sector, gamifying literacy and numeracy. and basically providing unschooled populations in northern Nigeria with smartphones, with solar chargers, with a library of literacy programs. And what we see, and also kind of increasing and encouraging families to send their children to school. So what we find through properly designed randomized controlled trials is that all families send their kids to school in greater numbers, in fact, by big numbers, 45%. But the kids who had access to the technology learned in that 1 year the equivalent of 5 years of schooling in northern Nigeria in 1 year at very low cost. This was, we looked at the cost effectiveness through the learning adjusted years of schooling, ranked number 5 in a list of 74 different interventions, and for effectiveness, and in the top quartile for cost effectiveness. This is a small trial, and as I was saying, there is so much more to learn, and as Dean said, there is not one study that will solve all our problems, but it is just an indication that we do need that kind of thinking and kind of going lateral and take advantage of new technology, mobile data, digital data, to actually make much greater progress much faster and get our not just the government officials, but also the local researchers and the local actors to partake in this process. It is motivating, it is aspirational, it changes the way people interact with their own teams and their own departments and their own ministries, and really kind of create a lot of increases expectations, but also increases the willingness to partake in this process. It's really exciting. It is not an agenda that is tiring and boring. We are doing it because it is actually very inspiring.
Let me ask you a question that often comes up when we discuss these kinds of issues, which is that and especially at places like the spring meetings where you have a lot of finance ministers around, they sometimes say this is little d development, right? It's a little intervention. It's not the scale. We're all talking big picture about growth and poverty reduction, and these guys come with their little studies. So how would you address that issue? And maybe, Golda, I would ask you because in a way, that IDB framework that is for the whole organization on project preparation, despite the low scores now that we're seeing in development effectiveness. But how do you talk about that? How do you sort of fit all those issues inside the institutional discussions?
I think that's a very good question. And I have been in meetings with ministers of finance that are basically worried by the output side of it, not of the outcome side of it. But I think it's the responsibility of these institutions to put the outcome discussion at the same time of the output discussion, and to engage in a dialogue where the evidence comes and where different possibilities are shown. I would also say there is a challenge to do that in the current operational model of at least of multilateral development banks. Why? Because the way money is made available and the liquidity of this money to be get by ministers depends a lot on the instrument which is used. And we have this paradoxical issue of development policy loans, which in the past were a stigma, are more being looked forward than the investment loans, which are a nightmare to disburse, to design and to disburse. So if the instruments are designed better to accompany in the end, the outcome conversation, like with results-based instruments and with other mechanisms that provide, let's say, certainty of disbursement, but based on real expenses and associated with outcomes, I think that a lot of this conversation can evolve. But so far it's complicated, and for me, you want the key turning point in terms of the operational model of this institution has to do with that. To what extent instruments will be able to move the incentives for the conversation.
Yeah, and it goes back a little bit to the issue you were raising, Dean, about what role for this admittedly marginal money on the side. Obviously, for some low-income countries, it's not marginal at all. It's hugely important. But some of the banks have a problem where they are actually going to they need to meet these budget gaps that are there. And that might be a good opportunity to sort of collaborate with trust funds or with bilateral agencies that are willing to invest on the knowledge side so that the incentives and results in the MDB financing work better. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as you think.
No, I mean, so first of all, what thought is what you just said is appropriate. I would also say that there's a striking, I've never really felt comfortable with how to deal with the following, which is take deworming as an example, since you put it up there. You know, I've put that same slide many times too. You know, it is from JPAL, so again, and you know, the thing is, you know, there's one thing about, it's one thing to say there's the highest return on an investment as a percent. But there's also, you don't give, you know, so it's 25 cents to deworm a kid, but you can't go 10x on that by giving the kid 10 deworming pills, okay? So, you know, so it's a high percent return, but you're not gonna, you know, you only make so much impact. But here's the part that I find, like, I don't have a good answer for this, but at the same time, it's still a problem. So even though that is like one of the highest returns as a percent, we're still talking about it. Like, why? Why is that slide so out there in the, you know, in public? And yet it still remains as the high, you know, a super high return on investment. So we still have work to do, but like we do have to realize that even if we get over that issue that I'm just describing, you know, we're never, you know, we have to talk about what's next. We're going to go down that chart, and we're going to find ourselves quickly into the middle area, which are still really good buys and important. And that's where the, you know, if you're going to spend $100 million, $200 million in a country, you're going to burn through the deworming budget very, very quickly, and you're going to be quickly onto needing to do other things, which is fine. That's the way that it should happen. But we do need to knock this off, and that is the space where you do that. You know, where it is a matter of collaborating with the next step. Some of it also, we haven't talked at all about the private sector, which is obviously, you know, like that's where my mind was going when you were actually posing this question too, was, you know, in my very simplistic view of the world, you got like innovators and knowledge generators working together. This is NGOs mostly, you know, some exceptions to everything I'm about to say. And then you got two groups that scale. It's like government, if it needs a subsidy, or if it needs to be done like, well, we'll just call it subsidy or some sort of regulatory issue. But if it's, you know, if it's a market solution, then, you know, let the for-profits do it, and that's the answer. Obviously, we can have failed states and things like this. There's exceptions to everything. But that's, you know, the more that we can shift in the second, and sometimes there can be subsidy money, which helps to kind of unleash the market and kind of show the way forward through some subsidy money to kind of kickstart and demonstrate. But that is, you know, that is something that we obviously need to take into account and think through more. Because whenever that is possible, that is obviously kind of the dream in a sense. It's just not always, you know, it's not always possible. But when it is, you know, sit back and see good things happen.
So let me ask you a little bit about, you know, back in the day, there was the idea of ex-ante economic evaluation, right? That's sort of the theory of change idea, that we would model the expected impact ahead of time, especially for something like infrastructure projects, which is also a big part of, you know, roadmap, resilience, reforms, and things like that. But here we've talked a lot about, actually, is it working in implementation, and what are the factors that need to change to be able to deliver on the development impact? And then we also have sort of groups that do ex post. But they can't really do ex post that well if they don't have all the part going on, all the data being generated alongside. So how do you see this whole system working better in terms of, say, what if we scale up resilient infrastructure investment? What would we be looking, like how should they organize themselves differently? Because actually people stopped doing ex-ante economic evaluation because it seemed like too many assumptions, quite boring, self-evident that everyone needs a hospital, whatever it might be. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I feel like we're on a pendulum swing a little bit. So how do we make it last this time?
So I have some thoughts.
Like, no.
But the first thought is, of course, there is a lot of economic modeling more generally, and in climate, that's a very good area for that. So what we can provide from the field, and as you said, project-based, but we actually can estimate those parameters, the behavioral parameters, in practice, empirically, finding out how to, get better models and better calibrated models. How quickly we can do that, that's a different question. But so the bank is doing less ex-ante evaluation of its infrastructure project. We still have to have an economic analysis, but there is a little bit of discontent in terms of whether we can believe those numbers or not. So we work with large infrastructure, surprisingly, because, for a long time, people thought that experimental methods were not amenable to working with large infrastructure. But in fact, the questions that we asked often, we asked the big question, what is the impact of this infrastructure? But mainly we asked the question of how to maximize the returns to the infrastructure and kind of understand whether we can experiment alongside that infrastructure to understand how to increase the returns. And then the question of ex-ante becomes a little muted. Why? Say, for example, irrigation infrastructure in Mozambique. So we find that the farmers were claiming large scarcity of water in this irrigation scheme, and we intervene with information, providing FAO provided guidelines on how much water they should be using. And actually, we're able to affect what we call in economics a Pareto movement in the usage of water, where the people closer to the source used less but increased the productivity. They were using too much water, and the people down lower in the actually had more water to use on their fields, and increased the productivity of the whole area.
Yeah.
And that halved the reported scarcity of water. And this was a relatively very inexpensive interventions on the water management and usage. And the example that we have many examples of that, and I mentioned to you an example from Tanzania water points that were mostly broken, so that for 25 years, there were huge investments in infrastructure, but no change in access to clean water. And through an intervention which was mainly institutional, reorganizing the operation and maintenance, understanding how to finance it, and how to make information flow from the communities to the rural water company, we could actually increase access dramatically. 50% increase in 2 years, when 25 years we had not seen any results. So the interaction between the ex-ante and the actual during is a powerful one if that during is focused on increasing the returns. The very, very exposed, kind of more project evaluation can really get informed very much by these processes, get a lot of data and insights into whether that investment was worth doing. So I think these are all complementary and can build on each other and be very fruitful if we learn how to work together. Sometimes we don't, but I think it's quite fruitful to then come up with,
If you allow me on this point, at the IDB, there is evidence collected that those projects that have been better rated at entry had better final results, better effectiveness results in the end. So I think that there is proof that if you invest in good design and you do ex-ante evaluations and economic analyses, you increase the probability that the project is in the end successful. What I see, there's quite a lot of pressure to speed up the project design process. I don't believe that the design is being delayed by these kind of studies. By the way, there are other issues that delay all the review processes, and all the structures that have to go through projects are possibly worse in terms of time consuming than these studies. But it is like an excuse to run on the project design and not complete some of these studies previous to approval. But the other thing, the important thing is if you have a well-planned project, that doesn't mean that it's not going to encounter difficulties or changes in implementation. So you should also have the right incentives for teams to adapt, to change, and be transparent and be accountable on what they do. looking for the right results in the projects. And this may mean, and that's a point that reflecting on what you were saying, my colleagues here were saying, this issue of knowledge related to local context, which is so important in implementation. And you said something which is very true. This kind of knowledge is very different to the other knowledge that we apply when we use economic models. And there's a tension in our institutions on how these two brands of knowledge interact. But you need them, and you need incentives for this knowledge to come in implementation, change, adapt, and find out, well, lessons like Ariana was mentioning in different projects that show changes that you may not have planned, but that if you adapt to the local context and reflect on it, you can produce incredible results.
Yeah, and well, this gets us into the whole issue of the kinds of staff you have on the ground to be able to accompany these processes, but we'll stop there. And we have not much time for questions and answers from the audience, or questions or comments. Go ahead. Wait, over here.
I'm Adnan Hassan. I served on the board of directors of the World Bank Group. The collision of empirical evidence, transparency with political realities and special concerns. How do you go about being expressive about what works versus what cannot be allowed to work?
Okay, that's a hard question, so think about that, and then we'll go to others there in the back. Ishani.
What do you mean by what is not allowed to work?
The political realities, you gave the example of the water in Ghana, for example. You know that if you took this water away from the front end and you redistributed it at the back end, that it would be more efficient, it works better. But if the front end is in the hands of families or businesses that actually have more power, then they don't want to release that water, even if the facts are that it works better. So how do you get that political exchange happening? And that's if anything in development, in fact, that's one of the big challenges. How the heck do you reconcile what we know with what's the realities on the ground, and how do you adjust your empirical analysis to those realities?
Many governments kill things that are well evaluated.
Absolutely.
So a question and with very positive results. So maybe you can think a little bit about how does the bank work then if it's responsive to its clients? This is a loan, it's not a grant. We'll come back to you. Ishani and then
Is this on? So I'm Ishani Kanpal. I'm a senior fellow here at CGD, and before this I was a senior economist in the World Bank's research department. So Amanda, when I hear you talk about sort of evaluation at scale, and we heard, I think, some of this in Ajay Banga's comments, I know, Ariana, you and Art have been leading a push within the bank for this. But for the larger IFIs, for the World Banks, the IDBs, the IMFs, to really think about evaluation at scale, in my experience, something has to change in terms of staff incentives among operational staff to really foster, and I think this is maybe tied to the first question as well, this culture of asking the hard questions, building project designs that are a set of options, as you nicely put it, Ariana. And then, following the evidence wherever it takes you, including when it takes you in sort of unpalatable decisions. So how does one think about that? And how does one foster that sort of culture? How do you think about aligning staff incentives accordingly?
Alan?
Thank you. Alan Gelb, Center for Global Development, formerly World Bank. Hello. A question about the bank. You haven't mentioned, a few years ago, the bank introduced a new instrument, the Program for Results. It's now quite a big part of the portfolio, and it is supposed to be a lending program that focuses on results. So how does that instrument focus into the kind of questions that you've been talking about in this discussion? Thank you.
Great. That's a really good question, because that is actually specifically mentioned in the roadmap as an instrument that would be more used in the future. So maybe we'll start with a board on the political economy of effective but politically unpalatable programs.
I'll try actually to connect the two first questions here and say a few words about that, because when I look at the field global development and I compare it to other areas in society I used to work with, climate and nature, education, social policy, some other things. My reading is that there's much more systematic knowledge out there than I knew before I started to deep down into it. But it's not as systematically used in policy making and implementation as it could be. That's the main challenge. While I think many people I meet who work in the field, they always say, we don't know enough, we have to know more. Of course, there's no end to knowledge. But I would say that my impression is that actually using it to do choices and implementation is the main challenge. So why is that? At least two things, I think. The first is on the policy level. These are, global development's usually part of foreign policy. It's a very politicized field on every level. In the MDBs, in the agency. I mean, look at where's the money coming from. It's coming from agencies, right? Yeah. Take, you're a third. The US is a third of everything. But say if you look at the 10 biggest, that's most of the money, right? And all these are run politically. Most of them from a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where it's very politicized, but also where there's not a lot of knowledge about these things. The slides I show here, most people who work on the policy side there, they don't really relate to or not know all this knowledge that many of the specialists in this room do. And it's also feeling that, that they're just sometimes political will just trumps anything, and probably should. I mean, what's more important, climate change or human rights? Well, it's a political issue, right? But also, let's take budget support or cash transfers. Some politicians disagree with those for political reasons. It's their legitimate reason, even though the evidence has a lot to say about it. The second challenge is more on the implementation side, and at least looking at our agencies and some of the agencies I know well. My impression is that so we have people with deep understanding of knowledge on the programs they manage and the issue they're working with. But the main challenge is, of course, when it comes to using knowledge that can actually affect the issue you're working with, the program you're working with, when prioritization could mean that something else is winning. And that's also, I think, I would guess that. That was the So they're looking. That's the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs intervened. No, seriously, I would guess that also within the World Bank and so on, these mechanisms exist, and we see them among our partners. So, going from, of course, we need more knowledge always, and we have to, better methods and all that. But trying to implement on different levels more of the knowledge we have in decisions and in implementation, that would be number one for me in using knowledge better.
Yeah. Well, and I think the selectivity issue that Koldo is raising and that you're also talking about is important when thinking about where to invest. I think we just have to, in some ways, the MDBs and the development agencies and especially an organization like Gavi, your own evidence. And part of that is bringing it again and again to politicians, right? Because people.
I agree. If I can comment what Bart said also earlier, I think we have to do a better job also at the narrative, as to be honest, because it's also to make it, you were talking earlier how you make it more appealing to ministers. It has also to be a narrative that is simpler and not so technical. Of course, as you said, there are various levels, but speaking at at the political or leadership level, it has to be simple. And I think that's why the deworming works, because it's simple. Yeah. I have to be honest, when I arrived in Gavi, I'm not a health expert, and I was bombarded with all kinds of indicators. I said it wouldn't work because the people I'm talking to are the foreign ministers, the development ministers, so it has to be simple and comparable. So I think the same way in evaluation, we have to pinpoint to something that they can relate, But that is simple. Of course, then when you go and talk to their respective evaluation teams and so on, you can break it down. But I think we do have to do that work, because then it becomes more politically acceptable. And it's true, it's not easy, but at least put it out there. And then, of course, then you see the reaction and you can be more selective or think how to put it forward. I think it's fair also to say, in our own experience at Gavi, it's true that there are things that may be less appealing to some donors or others, but there's always, and I see my team laughing, there are always things that is more appealing than anything else on the evaluation. And that's probably also how you navigate because not everything is equal, and eventually there'll be something that works better. And I think it's important to acknowledge it. But I do think that there's this work to be done on the narrative to make it simpler to digest and also more appealing, because I think a Minister of Finance that understands clearly how actually this evaluation can make the money go further would not disagree, but it's also making it easy to understand.
Well, making a difference in the real world hopefully
Yes.
should be good politics.
Yes.
And if we can't make it that way, then that's our fail, right?
Yeah.
Let's, about the question around incentives facing staff. I know you've thought deeply about this, Dean, and there's an interesting study that Coldo and Carol Alvarez were bringing to my attention that actually the project team leader matters a lot
Yes.
for the quality and entry, the management of implementation and learning as you go. So can you say a little bit about how you're thinking about this?
I would actually just second what you've been saying on this. I crib a line that I've been using internally at USAID, which is stolen from Richard Thaler, that summarizes basically all of applied behavioral economics, which is make it easy. And the idea of that is, he's saying it usually in the context of programs, something that is working with, getting people to save more or do things or get vaccines or whatnot.
Pay taxes.
Right, pay taxes. I'm saying this in the sense of internally now, how do we make it easy to choose the effective program, to choose the less is more example, things like this. And it's taking that mindset. And so I'm not saying incentives aren't important. I'm an economist, I have to say that. But it is, I think that is the lens we're taking, at least I'm taking, and trying to understand what is the decision-making process, how do we get the right information to the right people at the right point in time to make it easy to do that. The other thing I just wanted to say is on the bigger picture on this, like the politics question, is two very brief thoughts. One is, we can't win them all, but we can win a lot. So it's to recognize that and just fight for what we can and keep pushing. But the other goes back to your opening Norwegian line, "Fakta har makta." Did I pronounce that right? I really want to know who har makta is and why you're so mad at them, but I'll ask you that later. But that is also the answer. It's the idea is let's push forward on that and get the facts out there, and it's the classic line: we all have a right to our own opinion, but not our own facts. So let's figure out where we can agree on facts and argue about the opinions and we'll incremental and just realize that we're not going to win every battle, and that's okay.
I'll go back to Norway and start saying, the Americans are saying "fakta har makta." So now,
I'm thinking T-shirts or something.
Yeah.
So okay, one last comment from each, and then we'll conclude. But I think you have to finish this event speaking it correct, saying the correct pronunciation of this.
Get it right?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I have no idea. We can't. We're not doing well on your name either, I have to say. But Coldo, did you have any last comments?
I want to say something in relation to what Dean was saying, because that's the right approach. But I'm not sure that we have the culture to practice that approach. You see, a few days ago, I was listening to someone who's becoming very important, and he was implying that a well-run country is a country where technocrats are in charge. But tell me, where are technocrats in charge? It's not evident, but it is true that we are prepared to talk with technocrats. We feel comfortable dealing with technocrats. And when we have to meet politicians, it's not so easy. So there are trade-offs between technical rationality and political rationality. And I agree, we need a discussion and dialogue process where we need to try and see how far we can go. And this is the way to run the discussion and acknowledge the importance of political rationality, but trying to build on a knowledge into a constructive process. But this is a change of culture in our institutions, at least in MDBs, because we feel very comfortable talking with the Minister of Finance that shares the language and that has the same educational background. But he may not be the boss, and we may have to go to someone else who is really the boss and who we have to work with. That's one point. On the other issue that you mentioned, this is a part of a very clear concept, which is there's a lot of evidence on that management matters. Mm-hmm. And funnily enough, there are studies on World Bank and IDB projects that show that project managers are more important in relation to results than countries or sectors. And no matter you take Afghanistan, Haiti versus Chile or a well-run, let's say, middle-income country, the key difference is made by the project manager. But if you go to our incentive structure, this is not recognized. Even project managers don't exist. They are specialists or it's a different title. So there's an issue there between responsibilities, job description, incentives that should be tackled with. This has been, for a long time, dealt with by other organizations, and it works.
Yeah, so, well, good to end on that note. Please say...
I will.
Go ahead.
So say inquire after me.
Okay.
Fakta har makta.
The win. Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and thanks to panelists.